What happens when power mistakes silence for weakness? It began on a rainy evening at a roadside diner, the kind where the smell of old coffee mixes with the sound of tired country songs. A local cop sat at the counter, chest puffed, badge gleaming, used to being the loudest man in the room. Then a stranger walked in, tall, calm, skin glistening with raindrops, carrying nothing but a small notebook. He didn't look like trouble, and maybe that's what bothered the cop most. One insult turned into another, until laughter filled the room. A plate of food hit the stranger's head, and the diner went silent. No anger, no shouting, just the quiet sound of him standing up, his voice steady. You just made the worst decision of your career. Moments later, headlights flooded the windows. Black SUVs rolled in, doors opening in unison. The same man returned, no longer a stranger, but the lead investigator of a federal sting operation. And the man who thought he held all the power was now the evidence. Because sometimes, the quietest man in the room isn't afraid, he's observing. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, painting the city streets with slick reflections of neon signs and taillights. A dull gray fog hovered low, muffling sounds and lending an eerie stillness to the usually bustling highway diner on the edge of town. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The smell of stale coffee and fried food clung to the air, mixing with the faint scent of wet asphalt drifting in from the cracked front door. It was late enough that most patrons were regulars, the kind who spoke in soft murmurs, their eyes flicking up only when the bell above the door announced a newcomer. The counter gleamed under the weak lights, lined with stools that had long ago lost their shine. A neon open sign buzzed quietly, competing with the soft hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Everything about the diner whispered normalcy, but there was a tension beneath the surface, the kind you could feel if you paused long enough to notice. Outside, the rain pattered against the windows in a rhythmic, hypnotic beat, masking the distant sounds of traffic. Every car passing by seemed slower, cautious, almost as if the city itself had held its breath. Shadows stretched across the walls, dancing with the flicker of lights, creating shapes that hinted at movement even when there was none. A lone street lamp cast a pale glow on the parking lot, illuminating puddles that reflected the world upside down, the perfect stage for something unexpected. Inside, the local cop at the counter exuded confidence, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the room like a predator noting prey. Every sip of coffee, every shift of his weight, seemed magnified in the heavy silence. The diner's faint chatter barely reached his ears. Then, the door opened, and a figure stepped in, calm, unassuming, yet carrying a presence that subtly unsettled the room. The stranger's footsteps were measured, almost deliberate, and the soft click of his shoes against the tile floor punctuated the tension like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Even the rain seemed to pause as the stranger approached the counter, his gaze sweeping the room, assessing, observing. The air thickened. Patrons glanced nervously at one another, sensing that the quiet before the storm had arrived. Something was about to break the rhythm of this ordinary night, and no one, not even the cop, had any idea how sharply the scales of power would tilt. The cop sat at the counter, fingers drumming against the formica like a metronome. He was broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, badge polished to a shine that caught the flickering diner lights. His presence dominated the room before he even spoke, an aura of authority he wielded effortlessly. He scanned the diners with a smirk that suggested he enjoyed being the center of attention, and perhaps, in his mind, the center of the world. Every movement was deliberate. A sip of coffee, a glance at the door, a subtle tilt of his head. You could tell he had been in control all his life, the kind of man who believed fear and respect were interchangeable. Across the diner, behind the counter, the waitress moved with quiet precision. She refilled cups, cleared plates, and smiled politely at the patrons. Her eyes, though, betrayed a sharp awareness, a silent witness to everything. There was discipline in her posture, a rhythm to her movements that suggested she had seen her share of trouble. She didn't interfere, but she noticed patterns, small gestures, and the way the cop's gaze lingered a second too long on newcomers. Then the door opened. A stranger stepped in. He was tall but unassuming, with a calmness that immediately contrasted with the cop's aggressive energy. His hoodie, damp from the rain, clung slightly to his frame, and his shoes clicked softly on the linoleum floor. He carried nothing but a small notebook in one hand, yet his presence filled the room like he belonged to a world far larger than the diner itself. He moved slowly, observing rather than asserting, measuring the space and the people within it. Patrons instinctively leaned back, subconsciously aware that he commanded attention without raising his voice. The cop's smirk faltered ever so slightly, a flicker of unease that went unnoticed by most, but the waitress caught it. There was a tension in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the calm before a storm. The stranger paused near the counter, eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. His gaze settled briefly on the cop, unflinching, composed, almost like a mirror reflecting the man's own arrogance back at him. Through these small, silent exchanges, the diner's power dynamic shifted. The cop, used to dominating every room he entered, now found himself facing someone who didn't play by the same rules. And the stranger, though seemingly ordinary, carried a weight that suggested he was far from powerless. Discipline, calm, and observation, each move, each pause, revealed layers that the casual diner-goer could only sense, not fully understand. In this quiet, rain-soaked diner, three worlds collided. The man who thrived on control, the observer who navigated without interference, and the stranger whose silence would soon overturn every expectation. The stranger moved closer to the counter, his steps slow and deliberate. The cop's eyes followed him like a hawk, narrowing as he noticed the man's calm composure. It was the kind of calm that unsettles, not because it was threatening, but because it refused to acknowledge fear. The cop shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "New around here, heh?" His voice carried a mix of mockery and challenge, low enough that most patrons ignored it, but loud enough for the stranger to hear. The stranger didn't answer immediately. He placed his notebook on the counter, sliding it gently toward the waitress before turning his gaze toward the cop. His eyes were steady, unreadable, and for a moment, silence filled the room, the kind that presses on your chest. The cop leaned forward, smirking. "Funny," he said. "You look like someone who knows better than to sit at the counter in my town." Still, the stranger said nothing. He simply reached for the menu, scanning it with deliberate slowness. A subtle pause. A deliberate sip of water. Each gesture amplified the cop's unease without a single word being exchanged. The waitress quietly refilled the stranger's cup, glancing at him with a flicker of curiosity, not at what he was, but at the quiet authority in his posture. Then, the cop laughed, a short, sharp bark, designed to break the tension and assert dominance. He nudged the plate of food sitting before the stranger and said, "Don't you look like you could use a real meal?" Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed the plate and, in a sudden, careless motion, tipped it over, sending its contents spilling across the stranger's shoulders and down his chest. The diner froze. A fork clattered to the floor. A spoon rolled across the counter. Silence, heavy and electric, filled the room. The stranger slowly reached up, brushing the food from his hoodie with a measured hand, not a word escaping his lips. His eyes met the cop's, unflinching. The cop's smirk wavered. He had expected anger, maybe even tears, anything to affirm his control. Instead, he found calm scrutiny. Finally, the stranger spoke, his voice low, even, almost conversational. "You really shouldn't have done that." No trembling. No shout. Just a quiet statement loaded with weight. The cop leaned back, uneasy, shrugging off the tension with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Relax, man. It's just a joke." But the stranger didn't move. He simply set his cup down, wiped his hands, and adjusted his notebook. There was a patience in him, a stillness that made the room feel smaller and the cop feel exposed. Every patron could feel it, the quiet before the storm. The first spark of conflict wasn't a fight, it wasn't a scream. It was the realization that the usual rules didn't apply here, that this stranger, calm and measured, had already shifted the balance of power. In that tension-filled silence, the diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. And everyone, even the cocky cop, sensed that whatever happened, nothing would ever feel ordinary again. The diner seemed to shrink in the silence that followed. The spill of food on the stranger's hoodie wasn't just a mess. It was a challenge, a test of control. The cop, used to commanding every room he entered, leaned back with a smirk, shaking his head as if to say, "I own this space." But the air had changed. Every clink of silverware, every quiet sigh from the patrons, amplified the tension between them. The stranger wiped the last smear from his hoodie, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The calm in his eyes was a mirror reflecting the cop's arrogance, and the cop shifted, suddenly aware that the usual tricks of intimidation had no effect here. Every nerve in the room seemed to vibrate with the silent understanding. This was no ordinary man, and the rules the cop relied on no longer applied. "You think that's funny?" the cop finally asked, his voice pitched higher than before, a forced bravado creeping in. The smirk was still there, but it faltered around the edges. The stranger leaned slightly forward, tilting his head, voice measured and calm. "Funny? Not really." A pause. Then, "But revealing character, that can be." The words landed like a slow punch. The cop blinked, his ego prickling. He was used to being feared, to seeing submission. But here, in front of witnesses, he realized his control was slipping. And the diners, long silent spectators, began to notice. Eyes flicked between the two men. Some instinctively leaned forward, drawn to the tension, aware that something monumental was unfolding. "Look, I don't know who you think you are," the cop said, trying to reassert authority. "But you can't walk in here and spill food on someone else." The stranger finished, voice soft, precise. "No, you can't. Not without consequence." The words were a pivot point. For the first time, the cop's shoulders tensed visibly, his hand twitching toward the counter as if he might strike again, but hesitated. Something about the stranger's calm authority unsettled him. This was a test of ego, of power, and the cop felt the walls closing in. For the first time, he understood that integrity and accountability weren't just words in a manual. They were measured in presence, in observation, in silent authority. The stranger's gaze swept the room, including the waitress who had been quietly watching all along. Her hands rested on the counter, her posture unchanged, but the quiet approval in her eyes hinted she knew this man was different. No spectacle, no shouting, no performative strength, just deliberate power and control. The cop swallowed hard, attempting a laugh, a shield for his unraveling ego. "What do you want from me?" he asked, voice almost a whisper, though he tried to keep it loud. The stranger leaned back, letting the question hang in the air. Then, slowly, he removed his notebook from the counter. With a deliberate gesture, he opened it and flipped a page, revealing a badge pressed flat against the leather inside. The room seemed to catch its breath. "Accountability," he said softly. "Observation. Consequence." The cop's eyes widened as he realized the truth. The man he humiliated, the one he assumed powerless, was an undercover federal agent. Every insult, every display of bravado, had been noted, documented, and filed. The authority he thought unchallengeable had evaporated, replaced with a moral reckoning he couldn't escape. Outside, black SUVs slid into the lot. Doors opened, and a team of agents stepped into the puddle-lit parking area, their movements precise and silent, like shadows in a storm. Inside, the diner felt impossibly small. The cop's bravado crumbled under the weight of observation, and the patrons, once silent witnesses, felt the enormity of the shift. The stranger stood, calmly adjusting his hoodie, and addressed the cop directly. "Power is measured by control, yes. But true authority? It's earned through integrity, not fear. You forgot that." And in that moment, the diner, rain-streaked windows, flickering lights, quiet patrons, became a stage for a profound reversal. The cop who once dominated the room now stood exposed, ego laid bare, as the stranger's deliberate, calm presence reshaped the moral center of the space. It wasn't just a humiliation. It was a lesson in accountability, observation, and authority. The patrons exhaled collectively, some in relief, some in awe. The waitress set a clean cup on the counter, eyes briefly meeting the stranger's, a silent acknowledgement of the shift. Outside, the rain continued, but the storm inside had ended. Or perhaps, it had only just begun. Because sometimes, the quietest man in the room isn't just observing. He's waiting for the moment to tilt the scales, and when he does, everything changes. The diner had gone quiet, the usual hum of late-night chatter replaced by the weight of anticipation. The cop sat frozen at the counter, fingers gripping the edge as if it were a lifeline. Every instinct told him to react, to reclaim control, but the stranger's calm, deliberate presence had shifted something fundamental. Power wasn't wielded through intimidation here. It was measured in observation, patience, and unwavering confidence. The stranger stood slowly, adjusting his damp hoodie with precision. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. Instead, he let his eyes meet the cop's, steady, unwavering, a quiet mirror reflecting the arrogance that had guided the man's life. Every patron felt the shift in the room, even if they couldn't name it. The balance of authority had subtly, irrevocably changed. "You think control comes from fear," the stranger said softly, voice carrying only to the ears that needed to hear it most. "But true influence comes from integrity, from knowing your power and using it wisely." He paused, letting the words sink in. The cop's jaw tightened, the realization hitting like cold water. His dominance, built on ego and intimidation, had crumbled under the weight of calm defiance. The stranger's hand moved slowly to the notebook on the counter. With deliberate care, he flipped it open, revealing a federal badge tucked inside. The room seemed to exhale as the cop's worst fear crystallized. The man he thought powerless was an undercover agent, silently documenting every misstep, every abuse of authority. "Every action has its consequence," the stranger continued, his voice still even, almost conversational. "You thought this was a joke. You were wrong." And in that single, measured moment, the cop understood the truth. Strength isn't always loud. Courage doesn't need to shout. And the man he had humiliated, the quiet, steady observer, held a power far greater than his own. The room shifted not with chaos, but with clarity. The turning point was complete. Silence spoke louder than words, defiance carried more weight than force, and the diner, rain-slicked, dimly lit, ordinary moments ago, had become a crucible of revelation. Everything the cop thought he controlled was gone, replaced by the undeniable presence of quiet authority. The diner was quiet now, but the echoes of what had happened lingered in every corner. Patrons resumed their meals with cautious glances, aware that they had witnessed more than a simple confrontation. They had seen authority questioned and recalibrated. The cop sat frozen, shoulders slumped, staring at the empty counter where the stranger had left his notebook and badge. There was no shouting, no further humiliation, only the heavy weight of accountability settling over him. Outside, the black SUVs pulled away slowly, the agent's presence a reminder that consequences were in motion. The stranger had not yelled, had not humiliated the cop further. His victory was quiet, deliberate, a masterclass in restraint and control. It was the kind of justice that didn't need spectacle. The moral impact was undeniable. Every word, every measured gesture had rewritten the rules of the room. By morning, the cop's actions were already under investigation. Reports surfaced of the incident, corroborated by witness statements and surveillance footage from the diner. The humor and bravado that had once defined him were now evidence of misjudgment, and the agency that the stranger represented ensured the matter would not be ignored. Accountability had arrived, not as revenge, but as the inevitable fallout of choices made. For the patrons and the waitress, the lesson lingered in subtler ways. Quiet authority, integrity, and observation. The stranger had shown that power didn't always announce itself. It could be calm, almost invisible, yet devastatingly effective. The cop's humiliation had been moral, not physical, and its resonance would ripple far longer than any shouted insult could have achieved. Days later, the diner returned to its usual rhythm. Coffee steamed in mugs, conversations resumed, and the rain-slicked streets reflected the morning sun. Yet, everyone who had been there that night carried the memory of the encounter, a reminder that strength without empathy or awareness is fragile, and that quiet resolve often wields the greatest impact. The stranger's presence lingered in their minds long after he had left. His calm defiance had shifted the balance of power, not through force, but through observation and integrity. The cop had been confronted with the truth of his behavior. The diners had been witnesses to a subtle but decisive moral reckoning, and justice had quietly, unmistakably been served. No vengeance. No spectacle. Just the undeniable fact that a measured, deliberate act of accountability can topple even the loudest arrogance. And in that quiet, lingering truth, victory had been quietly and irrevocably claimed. Power isn't always loud. Authority doesn't need a badge to command respect. That night in the rain-slicked diner proved a truth many overlook. Control built on intimidation is fragile, but quiet integrity withstands scrutiny. The man who seemed ordinary, calm, measured, silent, reminded everyone present that true strength lies in observation, patience, and the courage to act when the moment demands it. The cop's bravado, once unquestioned, crumbled not through force, but through the subtle weight of accountability. The patrons, silent witnesses, learned that respect is earned through action, not fear. And the stranger, an agent of justice who wielded neither anger nor spectacle, showed that moral authority can flip a room without a single shout. Sometimes, the most powerful victories are invisible at first glance. They're measured not by domination, but by the clarity they leave behind, the lessons quietly absorbed, and the imbalance they correct. True authority doesn't roar, it observes, waits, and lets integrity speak louder than fear ever could.